Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out Poisoner in Chief. It's chapter 2. I'm only going to read about 10 pages. This is a long chapter. Dirty business. White flags hung from many windows as self-shocked Germans measured the depth of their defeat. Hitler was dead. Unconditional surrender had sealed the collapse of the Third Reich. Munich, like many other German cities, lay in ruins. With the guns finally silent, people began venturing out. On a wall near Odensplatz, someone painted concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald. I am ashamed to be a German. 4 United States Army divisions had moved into Munich, but infantrymen were not only soldiers in town. When they came to the counterintelligence corps, the semi-clandestine unit, whose men wore plain uniforms and identified themselves only as agents or special agent, their 2 main tasks were to suppress the black market and find Nazis. Munich had been the birthplace of the Nazi Party, so hunting was good. Agents compiled lists, followed leads, and arrested suspects. A notorious one fell into their hands on May 14, 1945. It was a splendid day. Among those who stepped out to enjoy the sun, walking silently past bombed-out buildings and piles of rubble, was Dr. Kurt Blom, who had been the Nazis' director of research into biological warfare. Kurt Blom. Blom was, according to one report, a well-dressed man, 134 pounds, 5'9", with dark hair, hazel eyes, and a pronounced dueling scar on the left of his face between the nose and his upper lip. He cannot have been surprised when an agent with the counterintelligence corps stopped him and flashed a gold-colored badge that said War Department Military Intelligence. The agent asked Blom for identification. Blom produced his passport. The agent checked his list and found Blom's name. Next to it was the code for arrest immediately. First priority. Blom was detained and questioned. Interrogators soon concluded that he had much to tell. He sent him to Kransberg Castle, a medieval fortress near Frankfurt that had been turned into a detention center for the highest-ranking suspected war criminals. Other inmates included Albert Speer, Werner von Braun, Ferdinand Porsche, and directors of IG Farben Chemical Cartel. Was that where Charlie Manson worked with Dean Morehouse in Mexico? You other experts I can't do this all. You other experts got to try to keep up. In this extraordinary company, Blom's story began to emerge. As a young student, he had joined ultra-nationalist groups and become virulently anti-Semitic. In 1922, after receiving a degree of bacteriology, he spent time in prison for sheltering the assassins of Germany's foreign minister, Walter Rathenau, a socialist Jew. He joined the Nazi Party in 1931. After Hitler seized power 2 years later, he rose steadily in the Third Reich hierarchy. By the 1940s, he was a member of the Reichstag, Deputy Minister of Health, and Director of the Medical Complex at the University of Posen and what is now Poland. There has tested the effects of germs and viruses on prisoners. Blom's complex was surrounded by 10-foot walls and guarded by a detachment from the Nazi SS, where a climate room and a cold room, in quotes, incubators, deep freezers, and steam chambers, laboratories devoted to virology, pharmacology, radiology, and bacteriology, a tumor farm where malignant viruses were cultivated, and an isolation hospital for scientists who might be accidentally infected with the poison they handled. Blom developed aerosol delivery systems for nerve gas to be tested on inmates at the Auschwitz concentration camp, bred infected mosquitoes and lice to be tested on inmates at the Dachau and Buchenwald camps, and produced gas for use in killing of 35,000 prisoners at camps in Poland where patients with tuberculosis were being held. His complex was officially known as the Central Cancer Institute. Blum fled from Posen to the Red Army. Blum fled from Posen to the Red Army, approached in January 1945. He was able to destroy some incriminating evidence, but did not have time to raise the complex. In a letter to General Walter Schreiber, the Nazi Army's chief physician, General Walter Schreiber, he said he was very concerned that the installations of human experiments that were in the Institute and recognizable as such would be very easily identifiable. For the next several months, he worked at another biowarfare center, also designed as the Cancer Research Institute, in a pine forest near the German town of Geraburg. It was largely intact with records and equipment when all Allied troops seized it in April 1945. By the time Blum had moved into Munich, his capture was only a matter of time. Interrogators from the Counterintelligence Corps confronted Blum with a letter from Heinrich Himmler, chief of the SS and a principal architect of the Holocaust. Himmler directed Blum to produce toxins that could be used to kill concentration camp inmates who were suffering from tuberculosis. Blum confirmed the letter's authenticity, but insisted that Himmler, not he, had directed the Nazi biological warfare program and overseen experiments on prisoners. The interrogators supported this to American intelligence officers who specialized in questioning Nazi scientists. In 1943, Blum was studying bacteriological warfare and wrote, officially he was involved in cancer research, which was, however, only a camouflage. Blum additionally served as deputy director minister of the Reich. Would you like to send in investigators? From the question grew a far deeper one. Nazi doctors have actuated a unique store of knowledge. They had learned how long to take for human beings to die after exposure to various germs and chemicals in which toxins could kill efficiently. Just as intriguing, they had fed mescaline and other psychoactive drugs to concentration camp inmates in experiments aimed at finding ways to control minds and to shatter their human psyche. Much of their data was unique because it could come only from experiments in which human beings were made to suffer or die. This made Blum a valuable target, but a target for what? Justice cried out for his punishment. From a U.S. Army base in Maryland, however, came an audaciously contrary idea. Instead of hanging Blum, let's hire him. Terrifying intelligence reports from Asia filtered into Washington during 1941. Japanese forces rampaging through China were using germs of weapons, killing thousands of soldiers and civilians by dropping anthrax bomblets, releasing infected insects, and poisoning water supplies with cholera virus. Secretary of War Henry Stimson recognized this tactic as a potential threat to the United States. He summoned 9 of the country's leading biologists and asked them to make an urgent study of global research into biological warfare. By the time they completed it, the United States was at war with Japan. The study conclusion was alarming. Not only had Japanese scientists been producing bioweapons, but their counterparts in Nazi Germany were testing them as well. The effort of these weapons could be devastating. The last defense is offense and the threat of offense. The biologists wrote, unless the United States is going to ignore the potential weapon, steps should be taken immediately to begin to work on the problems of biological warfare. This moves Stimson to action. Biological warfare is the course of dirty business. In light of the committee's report, I think we must have prepared, he wrote to President Franklin Roosevelt. Soon afterward, Roosevelt authorized creation of the first U.S. agency dedicated to studying biological warfare. From his anodyne name, War Research Services, no one could deduce its mission. Anyone curious, though, could have made an educated guess by noticing that its director was renowned chemist George Merck, MERCK, president of the pharmaceutical company that bears his family's name. Chemical warfare was caused at least 1 million casualties during the World War I, was already well known, but biological warfare, banned by the Geneva Protocol of 1925, was something new in the modern age. Merck concluded that the United States must join the race. The value of biological warfare will be a debatable question until it is proven or disproven, he argued in a long memo. This is but one logical course to pursue, namely to pursue the possibilities of such warfare from every angle. Merrick's memo reached American military commanders as they were considering a top secret request from Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Intelligence reports later proved false, but led Britishers to fear that Hitler was planning a bio attack in their island. They decided they needed a store of concentrated biopathogens to launch a retaliation if such an attack occurred. Britain did not have the facilities, expertise, or budget to develop their toxins. Churchill asked the Americans for help. Roosevelt asked to look into the possibility of producing biological weapons for the British and assigned the job to the Army's Chemical Warfare Service. On December 7, 1942, its commanders convened a group of bacteriologists and other specialists at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington. They posed a question that pushed beyond the edge of known scientific engineering. What would it be possible to build a hermetically sealed container in which deadly germs could be produced in an industrial scale? Patiently, they assembled scientists, explained to their military hosts, while fabricating toxins in the scale would be prohibitively difficult and impossible, one disseminated. Ira Baldwin, the bacteriologist who had been Sidney Gottlieb's mentor at the University of Wisconsin, and he saw no theoretical or technical barrier to the constructions of such a chamber. Practically all these people there have been working on pathogenic bacteriology, so-called medical bacteriology. And by the large scale, they were very skeptical, Baldwin later recalled. Either you couldn't cultivate in large amounts, or if you did cultivate it, you couldn't do it with safety. And finally, they got around to me, and I said, the problem is simple. If you can do it with a test tube, you can do it with a 10,000-gallon tank with equal safety and perhaps more. And you could preserve the virulence of the 10,000-gallon tank. And all you have to do is make the same conclusions in a 10,000-gallon tank that you make in a test tube. So I went home feeling I had done my bit for the country by venturing my opinion on the subject and thought no more about it. Soon after that meeting, General W.C. Cabridge of the Chemical Warfare Service called Baldwin and asked him to return to Washington. He replied that his company obligations made it difficult for him to travel on short notice. We're in hopes that you can arrange to be relieved of your university duties. General Cabridge told him, we need you here. What do you say could be done? Baldwin reported this to the president of the University of Washington. They agreed that he could take a leave of absence and serve with the war effort. When he arrived in Washington in the end of 1944 or 42, he was told that the Army had decided to staunch a secret program to develop biological weapons and wanted him to direct it. It was, he realized, a terrifically big assignment. They wanted me to develop a research program, recruit a staff, find a location to build a camp and a laboratory, and then design the pilot plans and the laboratories. In accepting the job, Baldwin became America's first bio-warrior. He had all the intellectual and academic qualifications to take on such a pioneering role. His personal background, though, he was unlikely candidate. His father had been a Methodist preacher. He was a part-time pastor himself, held Quaker beliefs, grew up abhorring all forms of violence, and lived austerely. Another of the United States entered World War II, though he proved as really to join its cause as any American. To understand the biological warfare program, you need to understand the climate in which we existed. He told an interviewer years later, "It's never occurred to me, and I don't want to say this, everybody was doing what they were asked to do. There was no question what the idea of using biological agents to kill people represented a complete shift of the thinking, but it only took me about 24 hours to think my way through it. After all, the immorality of war is war itself. You start out with the idea of war, of killing people, and that to me is the immoral part of it. But I grew up first in medical bacteriology, and if you spent your time trying to kill microorganisms to prevent them from causing disease, now you turn around and think of it as I had to was horrifying to some extent. No, the question about it. Yes, no question about it. It was horrifying to no extent. Baldwin remained a civilian during the 2.5 years he spent establishing and running America's biowarfare program. The title was created for him, scientific director of the newly formed Army Biological Warfare Laboratories, part of the Chemical Warfare Service. The Army gave him one of the most sweeping promises it made to any American during World War II. This is really important. Whatever you'll ask for, we'll provide. If I said I want that man, Baldwin later recalled, unless the Manhattan Project said they needed him, I got him. Baldwin's first task was to find a site for his new complex. That obvious choice was the Edgewood Arsenal, a 13,000-acre Army base facing Chesapeake Bay in Maryland that had served as headquarters for the Chemical Warfare Service since its founding in 1918. After touring Edgewood, however, Baldwin decided it was too crowded for the bioweapons complex he had been assigned to build. He wanted an entirely new campus. Baldwin was a couple of Chemical Warfare Service officers set out on a tour to regions outside Washington. They sought a protected area that was reasonably close to the city, remote so that experiments could be conducted without attracting notice, and big enough to become dozens of buildings, including large tanks in which dozen germs would be cultivated. First, they turned down an office from the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. The next idea was to communicate an island in Chesapeake Bay, but they could not find one that was the right size, and it was uninhabited. They surveyed and rejected a former shoe factory near Edgewood Arsenal, a weather station in Virginia, and Sugarloaf Mountain in Maryland. Finally, outside the Maryland town of Frederick, they found a former National Guard air base called Dietrich, pronounced Dietrich Field, named after an Army surgeon who had lived nearby and served in World War I. Airplanes based in Dietrich Field had been moved to Europe. Without remaining with any empty barracks, a cadaverous hangar, runaways, and a control tower outside the gate, passengers stretched toward Catoctin Mountain, a majestic Appalachian ridge, which the presidential retreat, Shangri-La, now called Camp David, was nestled. Washington is 50 miles away. This 1,000-acre base would become the literal nerve center of the U.S. government's search for ways to turn germs into weapons of war and covert action. The Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence agency, was using part of Dietrich Field as a training base and did not want to give up, but was forced to do so because Ira Baldwin's project was so high priority. On March 9, 1943, the Army announced that it had renamed the field Camp Dietrich, designed it as headquarters of the Army Biological Warfare Laboratories, and reached agreements to pursue several adjacent farms in order to provide extra money and privacy. The first commandant immediately ordered $1.25 million in new construction. Within 3 months, he had spent $4 million. Everything Baldwin requisitioned was immediately supplied, from custom-made bacteriological weapons to bulk quantities of chemicals to herds of laboratory animals. they like to torture the animals as much as the humans. They take the animals and torture the animals to infect fear into the humans. That's the way it works. Ultimately, more than 500,000 white mice and tens of thousands of rats, rabbits, guinea pigs, sheep, monkeys, cats, ferrets, and canaries. Everything about Camp Dietrich was shrouded in deepest secrecy. Military commanders feared that the news of research into germ warfare leaked out. Americans might panic at the prospect of a bio attack. It remembers one time we had a party and someone said, "Hey, lots of bacteriologists here, right?" One veteran of the Chemical Warfare Service recalled years later, this was quickly shushed up. We were taught at Dietrich, don't talk about Dietrich. Baldwin began his work by hiring a handful of scientists he knew, including several of the former students from the University of Washington. Their first few quickly followed by dozens, then hundreds more. Ultimately, about 1,500 came to work at Camp Dietrich. All were infused with a sense of mission, even a sense that they might hold the fate of humanity in their hands. They were passionate about their science. A Camp Dietrich historian later asserted, they were the best in the country. If someone said to you, here is an unlimited budget, here's all the equipment you need, tell me what kind of building you want to work in, we'll build it, we'll jump in at the opportunity. And that's just what they did. But an imperative was what we need results quickly. By coming to work at Camp Dietrich, the scientists joined one of the world's most clandestine fraternities. They required them to accept a new moral order. Upon joining, all they required to sign a vow of secrecy that bound them for life and beyond. Sounds like the Scientology thing they make you sign. They're probably related. And in the event of my death, this is what they had to sign to work at Camp Dietrich. In the event of my death, I authorize the commanding officer at Camp Dietrich, Maryland, to make arrangements for and conduct the processing of my remains and to place them in a sealed casket which shall not thereafter be opened. They put Kennedy's body in a metal casket. They treated, I'm not going to talk. It said, I authorize post-mortem examination of my remains to be made exclusively by proper Army representatives in their discretion. Just like President Kennedy, in their discretion, not our discretion. New arrivals at Camp Dietrich, many of them accomplished specialists with advanced degrees, were put through a special project school where they were learned the known techniques, facts, and potentialities of germ warfare. Courses that named like production of agents and fooled the water contamination. The science developed such enthusiasm for their new work that they even came up with a school cheer, which I don't even know if I can read this Dietrich school cheer. Brocculosis piscicosis, PUBA, authorities, antitoxin antibodies, rah, rah, rah. Early in 1944, General Winston Churchill abruptly changed the bioweapons order he had sent to President Roosevelt more than a year before. He feared that the Nazis might launch a last-ditch bio attack in Berlin on the desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war. Driven by his new sense of urgency, he asked Roosevelt to forget the time-consuming process of developing a new bioweapon and sent him something relatively easily to make, bomblets filled with anthrax spores. This he wanted 500,000. Only a few Americans knew of this request, 500,000 anthrax spores. Not all approved. Roosevelt's chief of staff, Admiral William Leahy, wrote to his boss that using anthrax as a weapon would violate every Christian ethic I have ever heard of and all of the known wars of law, the laws of war. Global conflict was raging, though, and Britain was under threat. Roosevelt agreed to send Churchill with bomblets he believed he needed. Pray tell me when they all are available, Churchill wrote in reply. We should regard it as the final installment. Ira Baldwin calculated that tons of anthrax spores would be needed to fill Britain's order. Since the project had Such high priority, he was easily able to commandeer a former munitions factory in Virgo, Indiana, and began converting it into a plant where the United States would produce biological weapons for the first time. Work was underway when, in May of 1945, the Nazi army surrendered. Baldwin returned to the University of Wisconsin soon afterwards. He had reason to feel satisfied. Under his leadership, the United States had landed his first bioweapons program. He had built Camp David into a sprawling research complex, complete with a railroad depot, a hospital, a fire station, a cinema, a served recreation halls. Hundreds of scientists, described as one official's report as Americans' brain trust in their field, were engaged in more than 200 projects. They produced industrial quantities of anthrax spores, bred mosquitoes infected with yellow fever, and even developed a pigeon bomb, a bird whose feathers were impregnated with toxic spores. Baldwin also directed work at 2 fields testing stations, one at Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah and another in Horn Island off the coast of Mississippi. He did what every army hired him to do: bring biological weapons into America's arsenal. Over 2.5 years of testing agents for biological warfare, Baldwin and his researchers had learned a fair amount about how to kill large numbers of people with germs. They suspected that Germany and Japan were still far ahead of the United States. Now the war was over, the key German and Japanese experts were adrift, cast of their priceless knowledge into the power of war crimes. This is why scientists at Camp David were so thrilled that they learned that Kurt Blome, who had been found, was in Allied custody. We're going to end here because this is going to go into Wild Bill Donovan, some of those other characters who were involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. You guys who study all this stuff need to help me out with all this stuff. Wild Bill Donovan, or Donovan Sage, or Mellow Yellow, lived on the same street as me as the Gottliebs. So I had Donovan Sage and Mellow Yellow and the Gottliebs, all on my street as a kid. So we're going to end now. We'll be talking about Wild Man Donovan tomorrow. Like and share and subscribe. Thank you.